Hearing and understanding God's call can be challenging, and it often takes others to help us to see it.
Here are some people from across Bath and Wells who have heard and understood God's call.
I've been involved in strategic financial management all my working life. But it wasn't until someone from my church approached me when I was in my early 50s and said, we've been praying for you and we think God's calling you to get back into ministry. That I realised at that moment that actually using my financial gifts in the kingdom specifically was actually a ministry. It wasn't just something I did. It was a calling from God.
I was a nurse at St Christopher's Hospice, and one of my staff gave me Doreen Gemmell's book, which was a shadow biography called Within a Yard of Hell, and told me I had to read it. Now, Drina and Frank were excellent congregation members, and I kept putting it back into the hospice library unread. Eventually, I read it in my bed sit in Catford, and the last page says, I pray that there are people reading this who will not ignore God's call to them and will act on it, because I never regretted it except for my reluctance in the first place. So I read it, I rang my mother and said, please pray because I think I'm being called into the church. And I expected her to say, don't be daft, you're a perfectly good staff nurse. Instead of which she said, pray and do what God's asking.
I wanted to join the Eco Council because God made the whole world for us and probably spent nearly his whole life making us for us, so we don't want to destroy it.
I think scripture really helped me to understand my calling to full-time ministry. Throughout the Bible we see God reminding his people time and again of the urgency to proclaim the gospel, the good news. And this urgency, it really resonated with me. And discussing it with older, other sort of wiser, faithful Christians really helped me to understand that this wasn't something I could ignore or treat as an add-on to my life.
Reflecting on what helped me understand my call, I think that yes, we are all called, whether we're called into our own backyards or somewhere overseas. But I think for me, what really helped is when I just had that sense that God was speaking to me, that I shared it, because it was too easy to disbelieve myself. And so I shared it with somebody that I trusted, and I also wrote it down. And so then I could go back afterwards and go, oh yeah, that definitely wasn't my thoughts. Those were God's thoughts. So this is something bigger that God has for me.
For me, it was others that were the confirmation of my calling. I sensed a call from God towards full-time ministry when I was in my teens. It was going to take 20 years of struggle before I took those first steps to formally investigate vocation. Year after year, there would be some prompt from God for me to reconsider his calling. I think the most surprising was when my university tutor, who I don't think was a Christian, said to me one day, when I was sharing with him what I was planning on doing after leaving university, that I should become a vicar. I remember changing the subject very quickly, but I've never forgotten how insightful he was.
It isn't always easy to spot when God is calling me, but each time it has happened, it is after I've asked God to help me discern where I fit. Where, Lord, can I truly make a difference? Help me to understand. The answers are not always obvious, and it takes time and intense prayer to discern the way forwards. But I have noticed that whenever I've stepped out in faith and acted on a calling, someone, somewhere, has said to me, "You are an answer to our prayers." There's something amazing about that when you stop and think about it. It's a joining of people who are praying for the right person to come forwards, with a person praying to God for the right fit.
After I was obedient to God's call on my life back in 1996, I ended up working in ministry as a full-time operations and development manager in the church where I still belong. But after 14 years of serving God in that role, I sensed God was calling me into something else. And that happened via an email that came into my inbox. And one of those things where you sat up inside, your spirit sat up. And I knew that God was speaking to me. So I applied for that job and got the job. And that is the debt centre manager for Christians Against Poverty through St John's here in Yeovil.
God calls everyone everywhere.
We all hear God calling in different ways.
Have you heard God's call on your life? How are you going to respond?